Okay, good afternoon, John, and thank you to ANZSOG for inviting me to take part in this afternoon session. So, as John said, this idea of this concept around the 21st century public servant is something that we've been doing a bit of work at the School of Government around for some time now, and I also did some work on this in the UK before I came here, and I'll say a bit more about that in a second. And so we're really pleased to take part in this afternoon session. And I guess many of you will kind of point out the obvious thing that, you know, we are already in the 21st century. And so what we, you know, to some degree, what we're talking about here. And I guess it's important to say that, you know, a lot of this is about scoping out some of the future stuff in terms of what the public service workforce will look like in 20 to 30 years' time. So Helen Sullivan and I are just finishing up a piece of research where we've done a bunch of interviews trying to explore really what sort of roles public servants will play in the future, the sorts of skills and capabilities that they'll need to achieve those roles, and something about the implications of that in terms of training, development, education and recruitment. So we've done this piece of work in Australia, and then there's a piece of research running alongside that at the University of Birmingham in the UK as well. So we've got a kind of a national and a comparative kind of international bit of data on there as well. So we often tend to preface this discussion by kind of pointing out some of the challenges of talking about the future. So, you know, inevitably things will happen that we can't predict at this point in time, and it's always a bit difficult talking about the future. I don't know if there was an Australian or a New Zealand equivalent of this, but when I was a kid in the UK, there was this show on called Tomorrow's World, and it was mostly about technology and the sorts of advancements that would be made in the future, and so how we'd live our lives. So it was all about how, you know, robots would control our houses and cook our dinner, and you'd drive around in a flying car, and you probably had some telecommunication device looking a lot like an iPhone that would be some sort of miracle as well. And sometimes, I guess, when we have these discussions about the future of government and future of public services, it can feel a bit like that TV programme. And given that often we're entrenched with kind of significant, difficult issues on a day-to-day basis, it can be difficult to talk about that future, that kind of fantastical future against the context of today. And if you read the literature that talks about the future of the public service, I mean, it suggests that we're about to see some significant and serious changes take place. So we've heard about many of these factors already during the course of the conference. So, you know, it's about changing relationships with citizens and about expectations. It's about changing demographics, efficiencies, economies, productivity, changing technologies and all those sorts of things. But you read the literature and it says, you know, we're on the precipice of some really substantial and significant changes. But then we also know that actually changes tend to happen sort of fairly slowly and fairly incrementally in terms of government and public services. So big bang, discontinuous changes aren't necessarily the norm. And so in our research, people have often been quite sceptical around this idea of the future public servant. And so that despite this idea that we know that government will have to change for a variety of different reasons, people are often quite circumspect about these changes and talk about kind of increments of change rather than more radical shifts. Public services the world over have a kind of reputation for an ability to reinvent themselves. And so people have often been very sceptical to us about, you know, the tomorrow's world version of the public servants that are set out there in terms of literature. So, you know, so one response to this discussion is, well, why bother? Why talk about this future issue? Because if that imagined future state is so different from where we are at the moment, and we know that things happen really slowly, and we're really good at reinventing things, and then why are we having this conversation? And I guess we'd argue actually it makes the conversation even more important. So if we know that's how change takes place, then we need to think seriously about that at this point in time. So we're not talking about a future that's not going to eventuate. It's about thinking ahead and strategic planning. So one of the things that we've observed through our research and through our conversations, and Andrew reflected on this earlier as well, is that everybody we speak to is really good at diagnosing the problems. So we know what they are, we can rehearse them, we can all go away and we can write them down, and we probably have the same 5 or 6 on the piece of paper afterwards. We know what the issues are and we know how to diagnose them. What we haven't found as many examples of are where there are initiatives that are in place to deal with this. So where are we starting to take these issues forward? Where are the new ideas coming from in terms of reshaping the workforce? So these issues are remaining still on the periphery of organisations rather than being a kind of central driving force throughout them. So I guess the first thing we talk about is, make a claim for these things to be, considered in more significant detail. So early on in this project, Helen Sullivan and Maria Katsonis, who's down here, who's from Department of Premier and Cabinet and the School of Government, did a discussion paper around these issues. And Maria talked in that about public services operating today under quite an industrial model, and Ian referred to these earlier as well. So where our organisations are heavily dependent on configuration of services and programmes, and we use those to drive our workforce planning, to decide what we need to recruit to, and to think about the sorts of skills and capabilities that we need within organisations. That's starting to shift a bit with this increasing focus on externalisation and outsourcing of government functions, and that might be something that John will talk about a little bit more after me as well. That, of course, isn't a new trend, but as we heard from Joe Hockey yesterday, it looks like it's going to pick up considerable pace in a context of contestability, choice, and fiscal constraint. So at present, if you look at the figures, regardless of kind of which state you look at the majority of public servants being involved in some aspect of service delivery role in some way. So when people talk about kind of the mythical future of the public servant, actually, if that trend continues, there are going to be significant and substantial changes around the workforce. So we've heard quite a lot of talk recently about the commissioning role, and this idea that in public services we'll be doing more commissioning and less in the way of provision, although I think there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of what we actually mean by commissioning. So that's something that there's a significant experience of in a UK context, in which I've been involved in doing some work around for a few years now. And what strikes me is that when I talk to people in Australia about commissioning, people tend to talk about it as a sort of synonym for outsourcing or contracting or procurement in some sort of way. So commissioning it's been seen as an extension of the outsourcing agenda, and involves working on the basis of kind of commercial contracts in the delivery of public services. So if we take that definition, clearly one of the important skills of the future public servant will be the ability to contract and to operate in a market-based economy. And there are often issues that are cited as being kind of relatively weak within the public service at the moment. I think what we'd argue, though, is commissioning is a much more broader and important role than just that contracting function, and one that needs some careful consideration. So to us, commissioning involves a whole series of different activities, from engaging with a range of stakeholders around needs assessment and service design, through to working with providers, market management, evaluation. And whilst contracting, purchasing, procurement are elements of that process, they're not the totality of that, and it raises a number of challenges if we do understand that to be the totality of that function. So actually the most difficult bit of that, and Ian referred to a bit of this before in his talk, is actually about how you build legitimacy in the eyes of a range of different stakeholders. So how can you be simultaneously legitimate to both the political executive and the broader kind of population that you're seeking to provide services to? And this made me think of a speech that Rod Rhodes did recently when he was talking about rediscovering the craft of governance. And so essentially what he was saying is that in recent times we've gotten terribly excited about ideas about scientific management and kind of instrumental rationality and driving productivity through a rather kind of narrow set of indicators. And that's damaged public services and the abilities of public servants to design and to develop and to shape really good public services. So Rhodes argues for a return to some more traditional skills that he argues have been lost in recent years with the impact of new public management and scientific rationality. And so the sorts of things that Rhodes talks about needing to include are things like counselling, stewardship, prudence, judgment, diplomacy, and political nous. Now, all of those skills are kind of not very tangible, and they're often not very easy to codify as well, particularly compared to those that we've traditionally recruited for in terms of public services, and which we still do today to some extent. So nobody comes in for a job with a certificate in prudence or a degree in political nous. And so there's a challenge about how we identify those things. They're seen as quite old-fashioned, they're not easy to measure. They're related to judgment and to tacit knowledge rather than a set of so-called hard skills. But the important thing about all these factors is that they all recognise the contribution of politics. So a lot of what we've seen around public administration, public management, public policy in recent years tries to write out the influence of politics or park it into a very narrow part of a broader system. Which I think we'd argue is unhelpful. It's an inherently political with a big and small p, with a big and small p, and that focusing on the craft of governance might help us reintroduce the consideration of some of these sorts of factors. Now, you know, before you go out or start tweeting, you know, Helen Dickinson says we don't need doctors and we don't need teachers, we don't need people with professional skills, which is the common comment that I get in newspapers or places where you write about these sorts of things. I'm not arguing for that. What we're saying is those things are really important still, but actually they're not going to be enough anymore within the kind of future system. So in the future, we'll need more than just these technical and kind of professional abilities. And many of these additional things relate to kind of softer skills around issues like those that Rod Rhodes pointed out. So a really important point here, though, is that actually we need to engage in some good strategic workforce planning to make sure that we've got the right mix of them out there in terms of our workforce. So we need to think about what the skills that we need and how we can plan and how that will look different from today. As I said, it's likely that the public service of the future will be much smaller, it'll be more agile, it'll have a different role around commissioning and around policy making. And so it's fundamental that we think about the sorts of skills that we need to do there, and the sorts of competencies that need to be inherent in those organisations if you are to be able to effectively work with providers and design and deliver services. So the sorts of skills we've heard about being important in the future in terms of our research are things like the ability to collaborate. So work across boundaries, interact with a broad array of different sorts of stakeholders. Being able to communicate, so not just being able to tell the story of the policy reform, but then also being able to sell it to an array of different audiences. Being able to think strategically is something that we heard continually is not well served at the moment, and you know, thinking to the future and not just in terms of where we are now in terms of public services. Evidence played an important part, and particularly around this idea of being able to build policy proposals that are effectively costed and provide a series of different options. So being able to go through that process. There's an important bit of work around design principles and new technologies. So one of the common comments around this is that today in public services and in governments, what we tend to have done is we've automated a series of pre-existing systems and processes, and we've used that to be the vehicle for these new technologies. But we haven't actually harnessed them into the design of services or thinking about how we might design our public service delivery. So actually we need to bring in people or develop the skills to be able to do some of that differently. And international literacy is another one that we've heard a lot about. And again, it's one of those that people say it's really important that people have it, that people are internationally literate, that they can speak across different cultures and different contexts. And that's important, not just in the sense that you know, that the world is a market there and we need to engage in that, but also in terms of the diversity of our communities and the ability to deliver to a number of different groups. But as I say, again, people often struggle to say what they would look like. Of course, all of those skills already exist in our public services. Our point is that actually they'll become more important in the future. And actually at present, a lot of them exist more kind of by virtue of accident than around systematic design. So it's got clear implications for how we think about recruitment and workforce planning, and also in terms of training and development. So whereas much of our training and development to date has been around kind of specific technical or professional skills, we're going to be looking towards creating rather different things in the future. And this is a point at which you have, for somebody who works at a School of Government, talking at a School of Government conference, you have to be quite careful about what you say about these issues. But what people have generally told us is that the sort of short training, sheep dip kind of courses don't stack up in terms of these skills and this context anymore. And actually what we need is critical reflection and time for practice. So there's a great wealth of untapped resource that we have in terms of public services, in the sense of the skills development that we could provide through mobility, and that's mobility through different levels of government, through different government departments, through government and not-for-profit and commercial providers. And so there are probably a bunch of more creative ways that we could do some development that would probably be more helpful than some of the options that are available at the moment. So I just wanted to end by talking about a different kind of example of improvement that comes from somewhere very different than public services, because I think there are a number of lessons in it that are helpful in terms of this context. So many of you, you've been following the recent Commonwealth Games over the last few weeks, and I'm sure we'll be delighted to see Australia top the medal tally for cycling, even if, you know, that didn't happen in terms of the overall competition. And I mention this not in the spirit of sporting rivalry, because you'll talk to me about cricket. But I guess because cycling is somewhere that we've seen dominated by British teams in recent years, and if you'd followed any of that through kind of the work of Team Sky and Dave Brailsford, they've got an approach to improvement that you kind of see talked about in the improvement methodologies literature quite a bit now. So I won't go into detail, but basically they focus on the aggregation of marginal gains. So they look at very small positive improvements that they can make that have an overall kind of cumulative impact. So if you look at the cyclists over a sort of 5-year period, they look really different in terms of what they wear, how they train, how they sleep, what they eat, and those sorts of things. But actually none of those changes have come about through significant or radical differences. It's all been about incremental gains rather than a sort of a revolutionary change there. So there's two things that I think are really interesting about this approach that I want to draw on today. So one is it's strongly evidence-based. So Brailsford and his team have a really good set of data around what they want to improve and how. So a really important point is they have a sense of what they want to achieve collectively. So the whole team knows what the priorities are and what they're doing to address those priorities. So they're all oriented around those particular areas. Then they collect data around where they want to be, and they have a clear sense of how they're tracking against that at all times. Now, there's quite a lot of money around cycling and other sports, but it's interesting that they did a lot of this with a more limited budget than you might imagine. And so what's really interesting here is where they found those disparities between their performance and where they wanted to be. They didn't go out and buy really expensive new bikes or go and pay kind of new cyclists more money or things like that. They invested in individual coaching. So they saw individual development as being absolutely crucial to delivering success. So they said no matter how talented the individual, they will always be better if they've got some kind of developmental support going on there. When we've talked to people in public service, and many of you will recognise this, the issue of people management is a challenge in the context of public services and is not always done as effectively as it might not do. The performance system doesn't always help people to deliver the sorts of outcomes that they might do for the organisation. It tends to be often more of a kind of a compliance tick box activity than it necessarily is about orienting people around a particular set of goals and aims. So, I mean, there's a lot different about this example to public services. You know, winning the Tour de France or Olympic medals may be a huge challenge. Arguably, kind of the day-to-day delivery of public services is more complex than that and challenging at a set of different ways. To my knowledge, performance-enhancing drugs aren't as embedded in public services as they may be in cycling, but you know, you may have another take on that. But there's a really important point here about kind of setting out to make change over time, clearly embracing strategic planning, having a clear sense of what they're trying to do and articulating that and sharing it across the team, collecting data that supports that process, and really investing in people and supporting them to deliver against those challenges. So there are no easy answers here, and if we're going to reorient the skills of public services, it's going to take time and it's going to take investment to do. But for that reason, it's in need of both urgent and sustained attention. So the research that we've done will be written up shortly and should be out in the next few months. If you're interested, I can also point you in the direction of a blog that we have with the UK team, where we regularly blog on issues relating to the future of the public service workforce. Thank you.